Happy New Year and welcome to episode 7 of the Review Crew. And I know what you're thinking. You're saying, aren't you guys like a week late? And we have to apologize for the delay. We were set to record on January 6th, but then a bunch of terrible shit happened, but it's okay because we're back this week. Review Crew is, of course, IGN's review show where we invite our friends from around the gaming community to talk about the biggest and best games. This week, we're finally talking about Cyberpunk 2077. I'm your host, Zach Ryan, and this week my crew consists of Tom Marks, Deputy Reviews Editor at IGN, Callie Plaguey, Reviews Editor at GameSpot, and SkillUp, host and owner of SkillUp. So this is the Review Crew, and we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about each of your reviews as a whole. I'd like to kind of talk on a philosophical level about your reviews and also sort of a tangible level. It'd be great if you could tell us sort of your history with RPGs and give us an overall context of how you played the game, where you played it, if you scored it, what did you score it, things like that, sort of an elevator pitch. Ralph, can we start with you?
Sure. So, I mean, I grew up playing RPGs. It's kind of like, it's easily my favorite genre. I play most of the RPGs, not all, but, certainly like a good 85 to 90% of them that come out, I'm playing them. Played Cyberpunk, played about 50 hours of it, did everything that I could do except for a lot of the gigs, the really open worldy sort of stuff. I said in my review that I really felt like Cyberpunk delivered on high expectations. I think if you walked into this game expecting can we swear in this podcast? Oh,
of course.
If you're expecting a fucking cool game, then Cyberpunk would deliver, okay? But I think what I would learn after that is that, and I guess realize more after that, it really wasn't the game that was promised. It sort of, there are a very large gap between how this game functions as an action game versus an RPG. And I think that it was very much positioned as a strong RPG.
We're definitely going to spend some time talking about just how much of an RPG this game is in the next segment. But before that, I did want to talk to Tom about his review. Can you tell us about your history with RPGs, your review, etc.?
Yeah, so I think I had played about, including the kind of 15 hours I'd put in a preview, but when I reviewed it, I'd played about 60 hours total, 45-ish hours before my in like that one save file for that review, and I give it a 9 out of 10. I really, really enjoyed it. My history with RPGs generally is I love RPGs. I generally don't gravitate towards like the completely open world ones as much, which is a little odd for Cyberpunk. And so I was coming into this prepared to like maybe not be totally hooked by the open world parts of it, but still enjoy them. And I really just found myself really loving walking around this world in a way I didn't always find, like in places like Skyrim, I guess. But I really overall just enjoyed this as the game it was, I guess. Like we talked a little bit about this, of the hype train behind it, and like the expectations for it were almost kind of inhuman in a lot of ways. And trying to look past that, I just sort of found a game that I enjoyed, and I agree was not necessarily the game that was marketed to us over however many years, but like what was there, I still just had a ton of fun meeting these characters. I had a ton of fun finding these different locations in this world. I was really impressed with the variety of quests, even if they were sort of, mechanically, simple in terms of input output. One of the quests, for example, that kind of shocked me was like the one where you're searching for the missing kid and you're like going around like this kind of horrible, almost Criminal Minds-esque story that was just like, I was impressed by the variety that was on display here. And then of course, alongside that, while I wasn't really amazed by the combat itself, I was pretty amazed by the amount of choice you had and the amount of sort of freedom you had to go about missions different ways. And I ended up finding ways that I really, really, really enjoyed, where even kind of like you, Zach, right out the gate, it was a little bit rockier, but the deeper you got into this game, the more I just enjoyed it.
I, like a lot of you, have been playing RPGs basically my entire life. I loved especially BioWare RPGs, so Knights of the Old Republic, Mass Effect being the ones that really drew me in. And obviously, really enjoyed The Witcher. I'm a big Gwent fan, to my boyfriend's chagrin, because he was like, "You should play and enjoy The Witcher," and I was like, "What if I just played Gwent?" But I really did play and enjoy The Witcher 3. And I also have experience rolling characters in tabletop RPGs. So I've rolled an actual Cyberpunk character in the tabletop RPG, and I am pretty familiar with the history of Cyberpunk as an RPG.
Mhm.
On the tabletop.
Sure.
But I went into the Cyberpunk review. I knew I wanted to review it probably a year before it came out, because I'm the reviews editor. I can assign that to myself. And when I'm going into a review this big with this much marketing and this much hype, I actually really avoid a lot of that going in. So I didn't watch a single Night City Wire. I didn't involve myself in any of the preview coverage after E3 2018. And so I didn't really have a lot of expectations based on the marketing. I went in based on what I knew about the tabletop RPG, and just what I knew about CDProjekt Red and their RPGs. And in that sense, like, I evaluated the game for what it was, and there were pitfalls that really disappointed me. I think that the overall story is really lacking in a lot of ways. My biggest criticism with 2077 is that it doesn't have a lot to say, or at least I didn't feel it had a lot to say. It brought up a lot of interesting questions, and I was so intrigued at the beginning, and there were so many threads that I followed because I was curious to where they would end up. And I would say I wasn't always satisfied with what I found. But there was so much that I really liked about it too. I loved the hacking. So I played as a netrunner hacker kind of character, and I really enjoyed the way that unfolded and the kinds of things I unlocked over the course of the game. I really loved the core cast of characters. Like I mentioned, Judy, Panam, and yeah, I played 50 hours. And in the end, I gave it a 7 out of 10. GameSpot also uses a 10-point scale. For us, that is good, which is the word we associate with 7. But I actually kind of waffled. I was like, do I want to give it a 6 or a 7? So it's like a soft 7 for me.
Obviously, there's been a lot of conversation about Cyberpunk, the disastrous launch on last-gen consoles, a bunch of updates, including patches that fixed performances, squashed a bunch of bugs, things like that. And then even just a couple of hours ago, we got notification from CDProjekt Red about what their 2021 roadmap would be, how they will continue to improve the game throughout the year. So it's been a bit of a roller coaster, but I did want to ask the panel here how, if at all, your opinion has changed on Cyberpunk as a whole in the month since the game has come out.
I think as a reviewer, especially with big games like this, you go in and you experience a slice of it. It's not possible to experience it all, especially with these RPGs that have multiple trees and all this stuff and stuff that you'll never even discover, right? And I think that is sort of, and I think my opinion on the RPG side of the game has definitely evolved because I got to see the perspective of people who played through different ways, different skill trees, etc. And I could see that a lot of that stuff just wasn't functional, So I had my own question marks about, because I went through, for example, the crafting tree, and I'm like, I'm going to go full crafting all the time, baby. This is going to be awesome. And I'm like, wait, this totally sucks. It doesn't work. Okay. And I was like, well, that's just one thing. And then I got to learn that actually those sorts of issues exist in other trees as well, So over time, I think my appreciation for the game as an RPG has sort of devolved somewhat, reduced somewhat. Yeah, I think that my opinion has definitely changed over time. I think that everything that I said in my own review was correct, and I really still agree with that. And not correct as in like it's the objective truth, but I stand by what I said. But I think what I've learned since then has evolved my understanding of the game further. And I definitely feel less affection for it now than I did at the time of the review.
Callie, Tom, do you feel the same way? Has your opinion changed in the same way that Ralph's has? Or, like what's your relationship with Cyberpunk 1 month on?
I would agree that there were some things that sort of like, when you're playing a game that has this much choice, it's really easy to assume that there's more there than you are sure there is, I guess is a good way of putting it. So like, I agree that like I stand by my experience in my review of like that's how much I enjoyed the game and the experience I had playing it for sure. But at the same time, I think I assumed there were like maybe more ways to change the ending or like more adaptable ways to change the ending than a week out when I started seeing like what was actually happening of like, oh, these are the very set ending choices where I was like, oh man, I've seen like, 3 different final missions for this game. I wonder how many there are. And then, a week later, I'm like, oh, I saw the 3. There were 3, right? Mm-hmm. And I guess there's technically a little bit more than that, but like that was kind of how my opinion of it changed, where I was like, oh yeah, this is a little bit smaller than I kind of had filled in the gaps of. But my, 45, 50 hours playing the game was still a lot of fun playing it, and I absolutely enjoyed that. So it's not like it soured the experience in that regard. I will totally agree, though, that seeing just how broken it was on last-gen consoles was incredibly disheartening. And this was something that actually Callie and you and I were talking a little bit about in kind of the week or two after the game launched, was like, this almost like guilt that I had about like liking a game so much that other people just couldn't enjoy the same way. Right. Yeah, and it's like, that's not the reviewer's fault. But it is like, it feels personal when you're like a game this much and you recommend it so enthusiastically. And then it's like, oh man, if you're just playing on a base PS4, like, I'm sorry. Right. Like, that's not what the experience that I had. And that's not related to that really. And that's why we ended up going back, and our own Destin Legary ended up reviewing the PS4 and Xbox One base versions differently with a different score that he ended up giving a 4 out of 10, because it was just such a different experience. And like, I think that's how I totally agree with you that like the feeling, like the like love for it kind of just like, it couldn't help but be a little bit diminished over time, just because there was so much sort of like pain associated with those like first weeks after launch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Callie, you were a little cooler on your review, less enthusiastic as the game on the game overall. But do you similarly compartmentalize your experience with the game versus the actual launch itself, the sort of the aftermath of the Cyberpunk launch?
Yeah, I mean, that's what a review is, right? It really is a snapshot of your experience as you played the game. And it can't be anything more than that. Obviously, like IGN and GameSpot, we both update reviews, and, we at GameSpot have re-reviewed games, like something like Rainbow Six Siege has changed a lot since launch, like those live service titles. So it's not like the final word, but it really does have to be a reflection of your experience, or else what's the point? So I like Tom and Ralph, I stand by everything that I wrote. I really believe in that review. I think I was as clear on my thoughts as I could have been given the circumstances. I mean, I think I finished it at like 1 a.m. before in the embargo, because it was such a tight turnaround.
In the industry, we call that a classic buzzer beater. So well done.
Yeah.
Is there anything else?
Yeah,
very rarely.
Yeah, there's many reviews that I have done just like that. So I think I did about as well as I could have done. I do think that, like, unrelated to the launch, I think over time I have tempered even my already like more mild opinion. So I do think like it really lacks a lot in the RPG department, which we'll talk about. So yeah, I think my opinion has dimmed. I've lowered it a little bit, but not necessarily related to the launch. I kind of consider that to be a separate issue, almost like a separate issue that I have about labor in the industry, and about transparency, and about like the way reviews are done, rather than the game itself. So they're two separate issues in my mind, if that makes sense.
I definitely walked into Cyberpunk having high expectations for the RPG side of it, because I think, certainly looking at The Witcher, that wasn't a very complex RPG. It's very simple in terms of RPG systems, right? But you got a sense from Cyberpunk that it was entirely about, flexibility, about modifying your body, about, just this all these different weapons and modding these weapons, and you just got this sense that this was going to be like open world Deus Ex but better. And I think that if you look at every part of Cyberpunk's RPG systems, you see the kernel of something really good and interesting, but it just really falls down and doesn't work because it just needed like 2 or 3 passes after that to finish it and then balance it. So even a very simple thing like clothing, you're like, cool, I can wear whatever I like in this world. This is sick. Let's just wear some cool outfits and look like Neo from the Matrix and whatever. But you end up looking like some trash can hobo because you realize that the stats that you want are on the gear that you have to wear, and you can't transmog that gear. Now, obviously, if you've played a lot of this game, you'll know you could upgrade your gear to higher level. That's true. But at the same time, that requires a lot of resources, and the resources aren't available to you early on unless you're doing like all the side content, like every single, gig, side mission, whatever, and you're like farming the open world. So that's kind of an example of what I'm talking about, where you needed to finish this system and have some sort of transmog thing in place where people could actually look cool in a Cyberpunk game. I can't believe you look this bad walking around the world of Cyberpunk. But anyway, and then you also needed a balancing pass to think about, well, what's the economy that supports this, Same went for me with crafting, where, I went full crafting early on, and I literally maxed that tree first. And I just, even though I was playing and I was doing side content and I was not rushing at all, and I was picking up every single item, I could not craft anything useful. I just didn't have any patterns. I didn't have anything, just nothing. That whole system did not work. And again, I've heard now that, later on, you can make really cool stuff. All right, fair enough. But I played 50 hours and I couldn't make anything good. You know what I mean? This is what I meant. It had a lot of systems, but it all just felt like they should have been there because an RPG like this needs those systems, but they were not finished and they were not balanced. I yield the remainder of my time.
I certainly agree with you on some of those body modifications, because I didn't really understand the overall purpose or use of those until I got the wrist rocket that let me blast a group of dudes with a rocket out of my wrist. I thought that was very cool. But Tom, Callie, can you talk a little bit about why you think or why you did not think that this RPG worked for you?
Well, I was going to say real quick, if I may, I agree with you that a lot of the cyberware felt a little weirdly incremental. But then I was also I guess my counter to that would be that there were things hidden in there. And maybe this is to your point about it just needed another pass, right? It needed a little bit more, but there were things hidden in there that felt really weird and cool and impactful to me, like the wrist rocket, like the double jump. I thought was a really weird, cool thing that, to your point, very expensive, but once you got it fundamentally changed how I was going about navigating the city in a cool way. And then there were also little things hidden in there, like one of the cyberwares was the thing that when you dodge while aiming, it slows down time, which felt really, really interesting. There was another one, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, that was all poison damage heals you instead of damaging you. So you could theoretically go a completely different way with that. So I think I don't think you're wrong, but I also think that there were nuggets in there occasionally that excited me a lot about that system. Although, as Zach has already mentioned, the presentation and UI and managing all of that stuff and the cost, like you just said, was maybe another issue.
Yeah, I view the RPG thing in kind of 2 branches. One is the actual role playing of a character, and then the other is the traditional Western RPG mechanics we're used to. So on the actual mechanical side, I wrote in my review that you had a lot of flexibility in your playstyle, and I do believe that to be true. You can go in guns blazing, or you can get the wrist rockets and just blast everybody, or you can use cybernetics to fry people's optics. And I think there were a lot of ways to a given situation, and depending on choices you made, you could walk right out of a room and everyone would not fight you in certain situations, or you'd have to sneak your way out because you said the wrong thing to the wrong person. So in that sense, I do think there was a lot of flexibility. What I was let down by was that the character that I was role playing, because it is your character that you create, I was role playing via a certain way, and I felt like I was able to do that in the side quests and in my relationships with the characters, but in the main story, I felt like that V was gone, and suddenly I'm role playing the V, like the canon V. And I think, like, I generally in reviews, I tend to avoid like armchair designing and like saying what I think would have been better, but it often feels like it should have just been a character, like a character that CD Projekt Red created, like Geralt, where you're role playing as
Okay.
that character rather than the character you create.
But you can only be a major league player for so long. The faster you live, the faster you burn out. If you don't get a bullet to the brain first.
Hey everybody, Zach Ryan just checking in here from the future. I just wanted to let you know that in this next segment, we are going to talk about spoilers. So we will be talking about the ending. We will be talking about some pretty serious story spoilers. So if you're sensitive to that kind of thing, if you haven't finished Cyberpunk, go finish the game, come back here, watch when you're done. Thanks. This is actually a perfect segue to what I want to talk about next, which is the story. But I think what you're pointing to here is really interesting, Callie, because you're talking about two different types of everybody's favorite word, ludonarrative dissonance, right? Like, I know everybody loves to talk about ludonarrative dissonance when you talk about games criticism. We're a gaming podcast. Who will we be if we didn't talk a little bit about ludonarrative dissonance? So here it is. So there is the ludonarrative dissonance that is obvious about this game, right? There's the idea that you are on a timing-based mission. You have a set number of time before your character dies in the story. That's set out from the outset. You're competing with side stories, the actual side quests, like the beefier stories that you see in the later half with characters like River and Panam and Judy, etc. But then you're also talking about like taking on gigs to make money to earn the skills to complete these side stories, right? And the secondary part of this is the difference that I'm calling the difference between side quests, traditional side quests, and side activities, right? Like the discrepancy between the missions that you, with the characters you care about, like River and Judy, versus the gigs that you're doing for, who's the woman that is constantly calling you at the beginning of the game? Oh, Regina. She has to chill out, man. Yeah, seriously. So I wanted to talk to each of you about this sort of difference in the importance of the stuff that you're doing. And I think one of the most interesting parts of each of your reviews is that you talk specifically, or at least hinted at, the right way and the wrong way to play Cyberpunk, right? Ralph, in your review, you said there is a wrong way to play this game. There's a right way and a wrong way to play Cyberpunk. And if you're planning on just doing the campaign, then you're really ruining the experience for yourself. And you may as well not bother. Tom, you say that most of the game structures are built like a redwood tree with a tall center trunk that has paths branching off as you go higher, but Cyberpunk 2077 is more like a large bush. You really painted a picture with that one. I really like that quote. And then Callie, aside from character highlights, side quests are far and away the best part of the game on a gameplay level. Let's talk about the superfluous aspects versus the more meat and potatoes side quests.
I think that there is a big difference, right? Where the best moments, the moments I remember of that game are the sort of more cinematic structured, centered on a certain character side quest stuff, right? Like the end of Judy's storyline is like phenomenal, right? Like it's so, I cared so much about that character, and like the story that they're painting there is really, really engaging and lovely. And that's kind of what I meant like by it when I was saying it felt like an RPG, where it's like this game takes a lot of time for conversations, which I think was maybe not what a lot of people were expecting at the time ahead of launch. When you see like shooty guns and mantis blades, there's a lot of time where you're just sitting talking to people, and you can go hours without ever fighting anyone if you want. And then there are those moments where, the larger sort of mainline story quests are a little bit more on rails, and I agree that like if you're just playing that stuff, you're missing out.
Was gonna leave Night City in the dust for good. Even started packing. But now I think I gotta stay.
I do think that the world is really full of these distracting side activities that don't make sense, and activities being distinct from the side quests. But then there's like side activities like the emergent stuff. Like I would be walking down the street and there would be like tiger claws like getting in a fight, and I'd be like, I'm dying. I don't have time for this. Or like you get the little ping that's like the cops need your help. And I was like, first of all, I'm a mercenary. I do illegal things. Why? Like it didn't make sense to me. To Zach's point about the Ludonarrative dissonance.
That was always the thing that like caught me off guard was that, like you'd see like notifications that were like, there's cops in your area that need help. And it's like, I just murdered so many people. Yeah. I don't want the cops to know my name. I don't want them to see my face. I'm not going anywhere near any cops. Like,
well, and I think that was as weird as that was. And I think, a lot of people rightly criticize that as like, well, this isn't Cyberpunk. You're a cop, right? Like that doesn't make any sense. And I think that's fair criticism, if not criticism that necessarily bugged me specifically during my playthrough. I think what those police moments are is a replacement for the lack of an actively hostile world like a lot of other RPGs have, where combat is part of travel in a lot of open world RPGs, where you're going from point A to point B, but you're going to be attacked by rad roaches in Fallout or wolves and drowners in The Witcher 3. There isn't that in Night City. You're not just going to get jumped by random people, so you can go long periods of time without combat. And what those cop moments are is almost a very transparent way of just saying like, look, we know it's been a while since you've killed someone. So if you want to go kill someone, there's this street corner that has some people fighting if you want to just get in on it. And like, sure. I didn't necessarily mind that, but also you're totally right that it's just sort of like, there's a lot of it being thrown at you that you don't necessarily want to do.
CDProjekt Red developed this game to have a shorter main story based on the data that not a lot of people finished The Witcher 3, or not as many people that they wanted to have seen finished it. Do you think that ultimately hurt or helped the overall main story of Cyberpunk 2077?
I feel like the answer always really depends. There's no, so for example, I've been really vocal about, I really, really, really dislike Assassin's Creed Valhalla, because it is this massive, massive slog that you cannot approach by any other means than going through every single part of it. It is literally like 75, 80 hours plus at a minimum because of how it's structured, right? And if you're not up for all of that, then you're ultimately up for none of it, because it's just sort of, you have to maybe abandon it after 30 hours and there's no whatever, If you had built runways off that journey, or you had built a more truncated journey with runways into it, that would have been better, okay? But that's a function of the fact that I didn't really like Assassin's Creed writing, right? And for example, The Witcher is like 50 to 60 hours plus, and you have to go through it on its terms, but I loved it because it's beautifully written, it's cool. So it's horses for courses. I don't think there's a single answer at any point in time with how this should be approached. With regards to Cyberpunk, though, I feel as though I really liked how it did its thing, because I come back to this idea of like simulated spontaneity, where I just felt like at any time I never really knew what to expect next. I would get phone calls from people and like, oh, cool, the next chapter of the side quest is available to me. Having now understood how it all fits together, I really liked the way it did it. I really liked that it was a 25-hour main quest that had its ups and downs for sure. But I really love the side content way more. I think it's far more interesting. Structurally, I think that CDProjekt Red really nailed it with Cyberpunk. But as I said, that's not the case for every single game. It's always different.
Now it's time for my personal favorite segment of the show. That is the lightning round. This is the round where I ask all my contestants here quick rapid fire questions, get some good answers from them. Some of these questions are goofs. Some of these questions are serious. I like to keep them on their toes. So let's start with a question directed sort of at everybody. Taking into consideration all of the difficulties around the launch, but also as much fun as we had playing the game, as hard as we fell in love with some of the characters, do we feel that Cyberpunk ultimately delivered on what the game promised to be?
No.
No. Callie says no. Anybody else?
No.
All right.
No.
Well, that's two no's.
I'd say no, but it delivered something I still liked, even if it wasn't the promise.
Fair enough. Callie, rank all the side characters from worst to best.
Worst to best, Carrie, River, Panam, Judy. Those are the core four. Yeah.
I could dig it. Tom, in real life, would you rather have gorilla arms or mantis blades?
Gorilla arms.
Why?
Because they seem more useful.
Okay, but what about in the kitchen?
Now you got me there. That was the one thing. See, I don't have a big enough kitchen for that, though.
Ralph, FMK, Judy, Pan Am River.
K River.
Hill River.
Yep. Mary Judy. No, Pan Am.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yep. And the other one, Judy.
Judy. Tom, in your review, you say that Cyberpunk isn't a Rubik's Cube to be solved optimally. It's a Rorschach test. This is a two-part question. Have you ever solved a Rubik's Cube? And have you ever taken a Rorschach test?
I've tried to solve a Rubik's Cube, but I'm not good enough at it. And yes, I have taken a Rorschach test.
Nice.
I saw a lot of butterflies.
Callie, power, smart, or tech guns?
Tech. I liked powering them up. Charging.
Ralph, which is funnier, roach spawning on a house or V T-posing through the roof of a car?
I think it's the car spawning on the roof of a house while someone's T-posing in it. I think that is clearly the best option. So,
the ultimate bug, if you will.
Exactly.
Probably one of my favorite moments in all of Cyberpunk was there's a mission where I was driving a van and my V was T-posing out of the top of the van, but also just bare ass in the wind, no pants on her at all. It's amazing. Absolutely.
No, did you
incredible.
see there's that motorcycles? That's how they stand on top. It's beautiful.
Tom, what's more important, your gear, your looks, or your stats?
Stats, but looks once you get to a certain point.
Callie, in one subhead in your review is 2 + 2 = 5. What's the best Radiohead record?
Oh my god, that's a hard one. I like OK Computer, but I don't know if I would say that's the best one.
That's my favorite one too. And then final question is to Ralph. What's your build for your inevitable replay?
I am going to go. I actually barely did any melee because it kind of doesn't work, right? But I'm gonna when I do replay it, I'm hoping that they fix it and make it decent. So I'll probably just go like full gorilla arms, mantis blades, melee the whole time, and just wreck shit.
Well, thanks to each of you for joining me. I really appreciate you coming on and talking about Cyberpunk. It was a long time coming, and man, did we reschedule this show several times. So I'm glad we could get it to work, and we had an opportunity to talk about this game. Probably one of the most important conversations that we've had on Review Crew here. So thank you, each of you, for joining me. Before we go, I do want to ask, where can people find you? What are you working on next? Go ahead and plug your stuff. Tom, let's start with you.
People can find me at Tom R. Marks on Twitter, although I'm not there too much, and then more reviews at IGN.
Callie?
You can find me on Twitter at InkyDojiko, INKYDOJIKKO. It's been a long time since I've done that little song on an IGN show. You can find my work at GameSpot. I'm the reviews editor, like I said, so just editing GameSpot reviews.
Your Twitter handle song is an absolute bop, and I'm excited to hear it every single time. So thank you for bringing it to the Review Crew.
I had to make the best of a bad Twitter handle. So.
Ralph, where can people find you, find your work, follow you, etc.?
Yes, just type Skill Up into Google and you'll probably find a whole bunch of training organizations, but amidst all that, you'll also find a YouTube channel. So that's the one you click on.
Thanks to my guests, Callie, Tom, and Ralph for joining me to talk about Cyberpunk 77. And thank you at home for watching. Each week, we're bringing a fresh cast from around the gaming world to talk about the biggest reviews. But we want to know what you think. If you've got questions, comments, or recommendations for future guests, drop them in the comments section of this video or shoot us an email at reviewcrew@ign.com. Don't forget you can catch our full, uncut chat in the audio podcast version of the Review Crew on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcasting service. We'll be back next week to talk about Hitman 3. And if you like this episode, be sure to check out our previous episodes on Game of the Year and the Xbox Series X. Until next time, stay safe, stay smart, and keep it locked to IGN.